When she was going for the second one, I said, why don't you just go and do a doctorate and get like, the PhD after that? But she wasn't interested in that. She wanted to get enough information so that she could actually go and work in the Spanish-speaking Caribbean. So she was actually going to learn Spanish and do a master's degree and travel the world. She used to work for a big pharmaceutical company. Then she worked for a big cancer company. Then she worked for a small cancer organization. And then she said, right, let me just do my own thing. So she just recently set up her own healthcare foundation charity. And today she's going to talk to us about 10 things Black women should know about cancer. So please welcome.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for the very warm welcome. That was really nice. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak again. So the last time I spoke at a Black History Walks event was like maybe 5 years ago. So I think things have moved on since then. So I was going to tell you a bit about myself, but I think Tony's pretty much done that. So what I want to do today is talk about the things that Black women should know about cancer. And the reason why I think this is a really important topic is because I think there's still a lot of stigma, there's still a lot of fear, there's still a lot of myths around cancer in the Black community. And this really paralyzes us. And it means that, when things go wrong, we don't really do anything about it because we're very fatalistic about cancer. We think cancer is a death sentence and we don't do anything about it. And this means that even though we're less likely in general to develop cancer, when we do develop cancer, it tends to affect us. We tend to have a worse outcome, so we're more likely to die from cancer. And the reason for this, there are loads of reasons for this. As I said, the fear, the fatalism, but I think as well as that, we don't really trust the healthcare system. We're a bit hesitant to go. But really what I want to do today is just tell you about some of the important things that you should know about cancer, signs, symptoms, that kind of thing, and who you should go to if you are ever concerned about any symptoms that you may have. So that's the purpose of the talk today. But what I thought I would do is I would start with a bit of background, just really to make sure that we're all aware of what exactly cancer is. When we talk about cancer, I know a lot of the times people don't really understand what it is, so I just want to talk a bit about that. But as we're here at a Black History Walks event, I thought it would be interesting to start off with a bit of history of cancer. So I'll start off with the history, then what is cancer, what causes cancer, some cancer facts, and then go into the 10 things that Black women should know about cancer. So is that okay? Yeah. So the history of cancer. So cancer is not a new disease. I think a lot of people think it is a disease of today, but it is actually quite an old disease. So early evidence of cancer has been found in fossilized bones, in human mummies in ancient Egypt, and also in ancient manuscripts. So I'll take each one of those in turn. So the oldest evidence of cancer was found in a fossilized Neanderthal rib found in Croatia. And they found that basically this rib showed evidence of bone cancer. And that rib was estimated to be 120,000 years old. So cancer has not just suddenly materialized out of nowhere. It has actually been around for a very, very long time. So that's the oldest evidence of cancer. Now, the oldest documented evidence of cancer comes from ancient Egyptian medical texts. So my history is not that great, but ancient Egypt at the time was not just present-day Egypt, but it was the whole northeastern, so it would be present-day Egypt, but also Ethiopia, so that whole region. So in ancient Egyptian text, which was sort of dated back to about 3000 BC, they described 8 cases of breast cancer, they didn't call it breast cancer, but what they were saying was indicative of breast cancer. So they described 8 cases of breast cancer. And they used this tool called a fire drill to remove breast cancer. And all it was they were using heat to destroy the cancer, and that's how they treated it at the time. And within the text, they basically said that cancer was not something that they could treat, it was incurable. So there was quite a bit of knowledge about cancer when you think about it at the time. So at 3000 BC, they were writing about breast cancer. So that's the oldest documented evidence of cancer. Then later on, a bit later on, 2000, not later on, but there's evidence of cancer in mummies. So one of the oldest cases of prostate cancer was found in an ancient Egyptian man, and this ancient Egyptian man was felt to have died around 2250 BC. So this is all just to tell you that cancer is not a new disease. It's something that has been around for thousands and thousands of years. But saying that, at that time, cancer was very, very rare. So they felt that it was probably, these people probably developed cancer because of some genetic reason, not because of the lifestyle reasons that we're getting cancer from now. So cancer is not a new disease, it's a very, very old disease. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move forward a little bit because there's another sort of historical character that I think is pretty interesting, and that's Henrietta Lack. So I think quite a few people may have heard of her. Now, Henrietta Lack died of cervical cancer in 1951. When she died, they basically took a sample of her cancer. And they found that this cancer, or some of the cells within that sample, acted very strangely. What it was those cancer cells were immortal. They weren't dying. So they thought, oh, well, that's interesting. So what they did was they formed a cell line from that tumor, and it was called the HeLa cells. And the HeLa cells basically were then mass-produced, and they're probably the most widely used cancer cell line in medical research. So because of Henrietta Lack, a lot of research was able to be conducted on things like the polio vaccine, cancer, AIDS, looking at the effects of radiation and toxic chemicals and lots of different things. So she played a very, very important part in our understanding of cancer. Now the interesting thing, or the controversial thing, is they didn't get her permission to take a sample of her cells. So right now they were having an ethical debate about that. Did they have the right to take her cells without her knowledge? And to be honest, her family didn't even know about it. Her family only found out years later when one scientist thought, hey, it would be kind of interesting if we looked at her other family members to see what their cells look like. And that's when their family found out that actually 20 years later, their family members' cells are still living in a lab that's been, all throughout the world. So that's another interesting health fact, or historical fact. So that's the history, or a little bit of history around cancer. So I am now going to go on to the presentation proper. So what is cancer? So to understand cancer, you need to first understand a bit of biology. So cancer is really a defect of the basic unit that makes up the body, which is the cell. So the cell is the basic building block of life. Our cells come together and they form our tissues. So basically similar cells come together and they form tissues, like muscle tissues. Little muscle cells will come together and they form muscle tissue. And then of course our tissues come together to form our organs. So what happens in cancer is that this little cell here, or one little cell, will develop a mutation and it will become abnormal, and it will begin to grow uncontrollably. And when I say grow uncontrollably, what I mean is that you have that mutated cell, it will grow, and then it will split into two. Now those two will split into four, those four into 8, until you have this big mass of cells, which I was trying to depict here with the green. So that's a big mass of abnormal cells, and that's called your tumor. And that tumor can grow and grow and grow, and it can then develop its own blood supply that feeds it. So that's basically what's happening in cancer, and that can happen in any part of the body. And basically that tumor will take over the organ that it's in. The organ will no longer be able to function properly, so that's why you get a lot of the symptoms that you get when you get cancer. And also it can basically spread all over the body. So in essence, your body is almost, or the tumor is just invading your body and taking it over. So that's what's happening in cancer. So what causes cancer? So like I said, basically what happens in cancer is that you get a mutation within your DNA. And it's that DNA which causes your cell to grow uncontrollably. Now that mutation can either be inherited, so you just inherit that possibly from your mother or your father, or it just mutates at some point in your lifetime. Now the question is, what causes that mutation? And as I said, in about 10% of cases, that damage is just inherited. There's nothing that you can do about it. In 90% of cases, it's very, very hard to know what exactly it is that causes that mutation. Sometimes it's very, very obvious. Smoking, sunlight, viruses, chemicals can damage your DNA and lead to cancer. So sometimes it's very, very obvious, but usually it's not that obvious. It's not that clear. What is it specifically that's damaging the DNA and leading to cancer? And in those cases, what we just tend to say it's probably a mixture of lifestyle and environmental factors that have come together to damage the DNA and cause cancer. So a lot of the times people want to know, oh, why did I get cancer? It's very, very hard to say because there could be a lot of factors that have led to the cancer developing. So the current facts about cancer. There are about 200 different types of cancers. The most common types of cancers are breast, lung, prostate, and bowel cancer. In the UK, cancer is now one of the major, biggest health concerns there is out there. So just in 2010, over 300,000 new cases of cancer were diagnosed, just all cancers. And when we just look at women, about just over 160,000 women were diagnosed with cancer in the UK. The incidence, so incidence means the number of new cases diagnosed in a particular period of time. So the incidence of cancer has increased steadily since the 1970s. So in other words, cancer is becoming a bit more common than it was back in the 1970s. But the good thing is that survival rates have doubled in the last 40 years. So that just means that more people are surviving cancer than ever before. Cancer also tends to be a disease of, we call it the elderly or the mature person, but basically the majority of cases of cancer occur in people over the age of 65. So 3 out of 5 cases of cancer would be in people over the age of 65. So now the 10 things that black women should know about cancer. So the first thing I think we need to know is what are the most common cancers that affect black women? So I guess the most obvious would be breast cancer. So breast cancer is the most common cancer affecting women in the UK. There are roughly about 49,000 cases diagnosed each year. So there's a lot of women that are developing breast cancer per year. The second most common cancer is lung cancer. So just over 18,000 cases are diagnosed each year. Then that's followed by bowel cancer, roughly about just over 17,000 cases in women each year. Then that's followed by uterus or womb cancer, and that's just over 8,000 cases a year. And then ovarian cancer, roughly 7,000 cases a year. So those are the top 5 types of cancers, and then you have your other types of cancers. And as you can see, there's nowhere there cervical cancer. So I think a lot of people think that cervical cancer is quite a common cancer. It's actually quite a rare cancer, but it just so happens it's the one that probably most people would have heard of, but it's actually not even on the list. I think there's roughly about 2,000 cases of cervical cancer per year, so it's not as common as some of the other cancers. So the second thing I think you need to know really is some common things around the common cancers. So looking at the breast, lung, bowel, womb, and ovarian cancer. So these cancers tend to affect women over the age of 50. Black women are slightly less likely to develop these cancers, except for womb cancer, where our risk is about the same as our white counterparts. So we're less likely to develop breast, lung, bowel, and ovarian cancer, but we're just as much likely to develop womb cancer as our white counterparts. The unfortunate thing, like I said in the beginning, was that even though we're less likely to develop these cancers, we tend to have a worse outcome when we do get them, except for bowel cancer, where our survival rates are about the same. Now, the reason for this is very varied. So if we take breast cancer as the example, breast cancer, we tend to have a worse survival rate for 2 reasons. The first reason is that we tend to, when we are diagnosed with breast cancer, we tend to be diagnosed at a much later stage. And obviously, if you're diagnosing cancers at late stage, it's much harder to treat, and you're less likely to survive. So that's one. The second reason is that we get most women, or most black women that develop breast cancer, tend to get a different type of breast cancer than their white counterparts. And that type of breast cancer is more aggressive, and therefore it grows very quickly, it develops very quickly, and it's a lot harder to treat. And that's another reason why we're more likely to die from breast cancer. Some of the other cancers, the reason is just down to delayed diagnosis. So we are diagnosed at a late stage because we delay going to the doctor for whatever reason. Maybe the doctor has fobbed us off or whatever it is. So it's just around delayed diagnosis. So I think the important thing to know is to know what the symptoms are. If you think you have any kind of symptoms, go straight to your GP. If your GP is not being particularly helpful, then you can go and see another GP, or you can specifically say to your GP to refer you to the appropriate secondary services. So that's the second thing. Second thing is just the key things about the common cancers that you need to know, which is we're slightly less likely to develop them, but more likely to die from them if we do get them. And the key to overcoming that is knowing the signs and symptoms and knowing where to go to get help if you think you have one of the symptoms. So when we think about the less common cancers now, so looking at the less common cancers, there are a few of the less common cancers where there's a slight difference between how they affect white women, and black women. So if we start with cervical cancer and we look at the over 65s, we know that black women over the age of 65 have a higher incidence of cervical cancer than their white counterparts. If we look at myeloma, which is a cancer of the bone marrow, we know that black people are twice as likely to develop this cancer as white or Asian groups. And then there's evidence to suggest that for stomach and liver cancer, we're more likely to develop these cancers as well. So again, the key thing is to just understand these cancers, understand their symptoms, and if you think maybe you have these kind of symptoms, then basically go to your GP. So the symptoms of cancer. So obviously each cancer will have their own symptom, but the key thing about symptoms of cancer is their persistency. So if you have any kind of abnormality, and when we describe persistency, we're usually saying if you have any kind of abnormal symptom for 3 weeks or more, then it's a good idea to visit your GP. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that you may have cancer, because there are lots of other things that will give you persistent symptoms, but it's always good to go and have it checked out. So for example, with the case of breast cancer, a lump or a rash that persists is something that you should really check out. Again, as I said, it might not necessarily be anything serious, but it's always good to check it out. And it's the same with all the other types of cancers. Any kind of symptom that persists, so with bowel, if you have blood in your feces, change in bowel habits. With lung cancer, it would be a persistent cough. With the womb cancer, it will be abnormal vaginal bleeding. With ovarian cancer, it will be bloating, tummy pain. So if you have abnormal symptoms that persist for 3 weeks or more, I don't know if that's me doing that, sorry, 3 weeks or more, then basically what we just suggest is that you visit your GP and just make sure that you get the symptoms checked out. So that's symptoms. So anything that's persistent, that just doesn't seem right, you know what's normal for you. Anything that changes, that doesn't seem right, then please do see your GP. The fifth thing that I think it's important to know is that there is screening for cancer. So cancer screening allows us to identify the early signs of cancer in people that don't yet have symptoms. So before you start to show symptoms, these tests can pick up cancer at a very early stage. And it allows cancer to be caught early at a point where it can be successfully treated. Now in the UK, there are 3 screening programs. So there's the breast screening program, which screens all women between the ages of 47 and 73. And basically it's a mammogram, so an x-ray of the breast. And it allows images of the breast to be taken so that they can detect cancer at this very, very early age, so very small tumors. Cervical screening, I'm sure most women would be aware of cervical screening. So that picks up very early stages of cervical cancer. And then there's the bowel screening program, which is for everyone from 60 to 69. So that detects hidden blood, or what they call occult blood, in your stool. And that could be the first signs of bowel cancer. So these are the key things that probably you should know about cancer screening. So there's only three cancer screening programs, because for other cancers, there's no tests that are specific or accurate enough to pick them up at a very early stage. So there's still work ongoing to try and develop screening programs for other kinds of cancers. But these are the only ones where we've been able to develop screening programs that are accurate enough to detect cancer. So this next one is the risk factors for cancer. So a risk factor is anything that increases a person's risk of developing a disease. Now, for most cancers, the most consistent risk factor, obviously, well, unfortunately, is things that we can't really do much about. So that's family history and age. Now, there are a number of other risk factors for, according to the type of cancer. And when I talk about prevention, I'll go through kind of all of those. But I'm going to spend a bit of time on family history and age. Now, the reason why I want to spend a bit of time on family history is because a lot of people don't realize that if you have a family history of cancer, that increases your risk quite significantly of developing cancer. And there are actually things that you can do. If you understand what your family history is, you can go to the doctor, you can be genetically tested. Things can be done to try and reduce your risk or to prevent you from getting cancer if you have a family history. So, as I said, 10% of cancer cases are hereditary, and they're caused by an inherited genetic mutation. Now, I just said it, but you may be at increased risk of developing cancer if you have a family history of cancer. Now, what we mean by family history is that you have 2 or more family members on the same side of the family with some type of cancer. That is basically what we mean by strong family history. So if you have a family history of cancer, there are things that you can do. It doesn't necessarily mean that, right, I'm going to get cancer and there's nothing I can do. There are things that you can do. What you can do is you can go for genetic counseling. Now what this is aiming to do is aiming to talk to you about what your options are. If you have a family history, it could mean that you have a genetic mutation in your family that's been being inherited from generation to generation. The genetic counseling will talk to you about that. It will tell you, okay, if you have a strong family history, these are your options. These are the kinds of things that you need to try to do to reduce your risk. You can have preventative surgery. You can have some kind of regular monitoring. There are various different things that you can do. You can also have a genetic test to see if you have a specific mutation. And so all of those things are helpful in trying to help you to see what you can do to try and reduce your risk of developing inherited cancer. So if then you went for genetic counseling, and then you thought, okay, well, genetic testing might be a good option for me, because I would then know for sure if I have this genetic mutation that's going to increase my risk of developing cancer. And you could basically go and have that test done. And once you've had that test done, what you can then decide is if you want to have preventative surgery. So if you did have any mutation that increases risk of cancer, you could have preventative surgery, or you could be monitored regularly. And all those things would basically help to try and either detect cancer early if you are in a high-risk group, or to prevent yourself from getting cancer in the first place. So that's family history. So what the key thing to do is, if you are just a bit concerned about family history, is just to make a note of all the cases of cancer in your family. And the idea is that you're trying to build a picture. You're trying to understand who has had cancer, at what age, what type of cancer have they had. And what you can do is take that to your GP and have a discussion with him about the concerns that you have about your family history. And then he can then refer you to a genetics clinic. And at that genetics clinic is where you go back and you have the genetic counseling and all of that, and you can have a really good discussion about what your family history might mean to you. So I'm sorry that I'm spending a bit of time on this, but it is very important because there was a recent project that was carried out which found that a lot of black people who have a family history are not even aware that increases their risk of developing cancer, and we're not accessing genetic services which are open and free to us and are really going to be beneficial to us. So that's why I'm kind of stressing the point a little bit. I see there's a question over there.
When you say family history and you look at cases in your family, are you looking at generic cases or is it specific? So if you've got someone with throat cancer, then breast cancer, then something else, is that like...
So well, I'm talking generally, but there are